one of the things that comes up very often when you hear Muslims talk about jihad is that you're actually looking at the wrong place in the Quran, that the Quran and the Muslim rhetoric has so many places that are conciliatory, that are meant to present a kind of a coexistent religion that is seeking peace. And very often they would quote, one of the things that gets quoted is the no compulsion in religion verse. And on the other hand, you have these other verses that explicitly talk about killing those who do not believe in Allah. And so how is it that these things sit together? How do we actually understand what's going on? The main thing here is to actually think about reading the Quran chronologically instead of just saying, this is a kind of a continuous body that has a kind of a self-consistent set of ideas that are presented in a way that has no contradictions. All religious texts have contradictions. And this has to do with the fact that, in part, it's something that has been written over a long period of time. Supposedly, the Quran was written over a period of 23 years. Under two very different conditions, one in Mecca, one in Medina. And so you have to think about this whole thing as a kind of a chronological progression of the events that Muhammad underwent and his community in connection with how they were dealing with their surroundings. First with the idolaters, who are not really idolaters, they were just associators of Allah with other deities. And then you have the Christians and the Jews, and then you have the broader world beyond that. And so if you go back to the very beginning, the place where something like no compulsion in religion took place, the other verse that Barack Obama, for example, quoted at one point, where he's quoting the infidels surah that talks about you have your religion, I have my religion, and it goes into something like that. And it seems to be something even secular, giving the people the ability to have and adopt their own religion. So I would call that the Taqiyya stage, where people at the time did not have the ability to impose their ideas.
Remind me what Taqiyya is?
Yeah, Taqiyya is a kind of a pragmatic hypocrisy, let's say, that lets the Muslim say what he doesn't actually believe. At the time, it might not have been the case. We're talking about way back at the very beginning of Islam. It might have been the case that he was really thinking about coexistence. He never really thought about being able to dominate his tribe in the way that he did. And so it might have been genuine. But if you look at the subsequent practice of Muslims as they started conquering places and being communities in other places, you start seeing that this is a stage that really explicitly happens very often. So you have that, and this is something that you see very commonly in places today where Muslims are not the majority, where Muslims don't have power. Then comes the defensive stage, where they start acting, but not in a way that would be offensive. And then the offensive stage, that's when Muhammad went to Medina and started attacking caravans that are coming from Mecca, and then started overpowering other tribes. And then you have that global stage after they were able to establish themselves in Arabia and started expanding beyond it. So I don't know if you have some comments on this, or you had some ideas that you wanted.
We have some comments. I don't know if this is too related. You and I discussed this a little bit, that the Sunnis don't focus so much on Taqiyya the way the Shia do, and we talked about why it's the case, but it's not a scripture thing, and it's a happenstance of history where the Shi'i were always in a small minority to the majority in an atmosphere where, you know, minorities are oppressed big time.
To some extent, but it does
So
have
you need to lie more to protect yourself. So that's the Shi'i way.
it does have some scriptural backing. It's just that for Sunnis, because they have been the majority for such a long time, it's not something that usually comes up, and that's why they would say, "Well, look, that's a Shi'i thing," and in fact, it helps them. It helps them denigrate the Shiites because of the fact that there is a group in the Quran, the hypocrites, al-munafiqun, which has a whole section of verses about it. So just to give a context of who these hypocrites were, when Muhammad went to Medina and was able to impose his power there, there were people obviously who opposed him. Not everybody was happy with him becoming king of this polity where he came from a different town, left his people, brought his mercenaries with him, and now he wants to impose his power. So some people started opposing him. And some of the opposition was a kind of an underground thing where they would act in a way, and then they would act in a way that seems to be supporting him, but in reality doesn't conform with what they're actually doing behind his back, if you will. And so even though he was acting with that kind of hypocrisy himself when he was in Mecca, he now started denigrating that group. And that's why the Sunnis themselves, when they want to think about Taqiyya, they associate it with Shiite minority as a negative thing.
I mean, another aspect of it is, and I think every or almost every Muslim has this, you know, we were told to believe that our religion is good. And so if somebody tells us our religion is bad, our first thought from this framework of thinking, which isn't the correct way of thinking, but it's the way that we're told before we learn scientific thinking, for example, we're told that, you know, the first thought you have is, no, you're wrong. That's not what Islam is, because Islam is good. Obviously, you're like, there's a contradiction there, and they just land on, hey, you're just saying something wrong about Islam. I forgot why I brought this up. Why did that come up? Do you remember?
So we were talking in the context of Taqiyya.
Yeah. Oh. So the Sunnis, you know, if somebody says, hey, your Sunni Islam also has Taqiyya, and, you know, if you don't know much, your first thought is, no way, that sounds crazy. Of course not. Taqiyya sounds evil. Islam's not evil, therefore there's no Taqiyya in our Islam. Oh, but Shi'i does, because they talk about it all the time. There's not a lot of thinking going on there, but
well,
that's just
there's a lot of denigration on both sides, and you can imagine that for something that has been able to last, a feud that has been able to last for 1400 years, there is something that's fueling it. It's not something that can just fade away. But both sides demonize each other.
Is there a big feud? I guess I don't know where the feud is, because in my entire time of being a Muslim, and maybe I don't count because I lived in the US, I never heard Sunnis and Shias fighting each other. Even my parents never said, hey, you're Sunni.
Okay.
I didn't know what Sunni and Shia was.
Well, let me give you something. Let me give you something from my own experience. So living in a predominantly Sunni society, and one that mainly supported Iraq in its fight against Iran, we were flooded with messages about how the Shiites are bad. In fact, the moment that you see
they were propagandizing you against the Iranians.
Yeah. So
who are 80% Shia, while Iraq is 80% Sunni.
Right. And so in my mind, the moment I would see the flag of Iran, I would basically I'm conditioned to see something that's evil.
Okay, but that's again, aside from there being something there from 1400 years ago, or it's something that's reinvigorated by current leaders who are trying to mind control people
Right.
politically.
Right. So that's to some extent what's actually happening in a situation where you have equilibrium, more or less, that's been lasting for quite a long time now. So that you have the Shiites mainly in Iran, a little bit of Pakistan in pockets here and there. And so you have this kind of equilibrium that is not going into an open conflict. But over the centuries, there has been a lot of conflict. And the fact that you have these two groups that have been separated based on that original conflict, that tells you that there's always the potential for something to develop into a conflict if there's some kind of conflict of interest.
It sounds to me like, and I want to get back to the point on defensive stage, but it sounds to me like all these negative aspects have to be reinvigorated in order to remain there and continue as a thing in the next generation. If it's not reinvigorated, I think it goes away.
I think right now it's at a stage where it has been so entrenched in theological beliefs that it's not something that it can lay dormant. Let's say this way, it can lay dormant, but it's not something that can be abolished.
It's dormant in a couple of ways. One way, it's written in a book 1400 years ago or whatever, and another way it's dormant is like, even, ideas in our heads that pass on from generation to generation, cultural things that aren't necessarily written in a book anywhere, like the concept of shame, by the way, or actually let's say the concept of revenge. Like, the revenge is really old. Eye for an eye is really old. It goes back to at least as old as Judaism. I'm sure it's much older than that.
Yeah.
It was a thing before we wrote stuff like that down. Similar to language, by the way. We had language, spoken language. Then afterwards, we decided to write down what that is. And we had grammar, spoken grammar. And later, somebody figured out, hey, let's write down what the rules are. We didn't invent the rules after the fact. This is a little bit similar. These ideas that are in Islam that are also written in the Quran, they're ideas that are much older, much more complex than what's written in the Quran too. Like the concept of revenge, a little bit of that is in the Quran. It doesn't explain it very well. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's a very shitty version of it. It's on the wrong side of that concept too.
It's not just that particular concept. Any kind of concept in the Quran you would actually see is explained in a very cryptic way that's not clear enough, and that's one of the reasons why you have all those interpretations, all those exegeses that start from the text of the Quran, and then you start looking for traditions, for hadiths that would support that. Some of these hadiths were particularly actually invented well after the fact in order to support a certain position for how you would want to interpret this. So that's why you end up with so many different ways of looking at a specific verse. Like, for example, no compulsion in religion. What does that actually mean? Is it something that's saying, well, you can believe whatever you want? That's not how it works. There is a very specific way to think about this. If you go into Islam, you are not supposedly being forced to go into Islam, at least in that particular stage. There are certain ways to control this. But then if you want to leave Islam, now there's compulsion, because you would have a very specific punishment. Going into the place is not the same as leaving. So it's not something that's absolute.